What is the word dispensationalism? What's a basic definition of that?
Of dispensational,
Yeah.
the word actually means house rule. It means administration, I guess would be the key.
Okay.
But it's a dispensational hermeneutic is the result of from studying the scriptures, seeing that God works administratively in different ways at different times with different people throughout history.
Okay.
Now some people, for instance, like Schofield, has got it nailed right down to this little system. I don't really care so much for the system. I like the hermeneutic. And John Darby, for instance, who I would have much more in common with in this, would be, for instance, he would have been the first one to really key in on the difference between Israel and the church. And because he took a plain sense of understanding of the scriptures, he said when God says Israel, he means Israel. When God says the church, he means the church. And to us that seems pretty common sense, but we got to remember that we've been, influenced by Christians who have held to that probably all our lives, right? Many people, for instance, Presbyterians, if somebody was saved out of a Presbyterian church or a Dutch Reformed church or something, they might have learned something completely different. That sometimes Israel is Israel nationally, sometimes Israel is spiritual Israel, which means the church, right? Whereas if you apply this hermeneutic consistently, Israel is always Israel, and the church is always a church, right? It's plain sense. Okay? So, number one, and we're just barely going to touch on these things, just enough to give people an understanding there and of where to begin. So number one, the literal interpretation requires that we assign to every word the same meaning that it would have in its normal usage, whether in speaking, writing, or thinking. Now, that means, and because when you start studying hermeneutics, you can get into a lot more than what we're going to look at. For instance, when you're studying books of poetry, okay, the hermeneutic that you use there is going to be based on the same premise, okay, but it's going to have some certain little differences because poetically we use words differently than we would, let's say, in normal usage.
We'll use metaphors.
Yeah, exactly. So, but the literal interpretation doesn't mean that we take everything literally. For instance, when John's speaking about the horses in Revelation, well, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be a big horse coming out of the heavens. It may be, but we're not going to look at that. But it doesn't necessarily, because it could be a figure of speech. And if it's a figure of speech, then we understand it as a figure of speech, just like we would.
Or the hand of God.
Exactly, the hand of God. That's right. And
Timothy, asking Timothy to go get his cloak. Paul asking Timothy to go get his cloak in one of the books.
yeah,
We're not going to go to Troas or wherever.
not us, but Timothy might have sent for them.
Right.
Yeah, we'll understand that he did, right? And actually, that's the verse that kept, because John Darby had gone through a real bad experience. He fell off a horse and been bedridden for 6 months. And during that, he came, he was just going to depend on God and the Bible. So he's going to throw out all of his books and just God and the Bible. And he read that verse, for Timothy to go get the books and the parchments, especially the parchments. So he kept all his books because of that verse. But anyway, it's like we don't go, but Timothy probably did. He went and got the books and brought them to Paul, right, in his cloak. But we, so that's the interpretation. With the application isn't that we're going to go get all the books, right? But if we're looking at, actually we'll look at these. Lost my train of thought there. Because when we're looking at the literal sense, okay, here's a word, all. Okay, we all use all of the time, don't we? Yes or no? If you understand that I'm using hyperbole, yes, we all use all of the time. I'm using a legitimate exaggeration in order to make a point. And that we all do it. And we all do it all the time. Or we do it often.
But we don't literally do it.
But we don't literally do it all the time.
Right.
And we don't literally all do it. If somebody doesn't, I imagine there's people that have grown up in China who've never heard the word all. So like they don't, it's, so we don't take that literally, but we understand that hyperbole is proper and
Like someone say, you're all against me.
yeah,
Or everyone's against me.
exactly.
It's not literally everyone that's against you, but you feel like it. Right.
Or when a biblical example of that is when the Pharisees said that the whole world has gone after Jesus. Well, that would have been wonderful if it was true literally, but it wasn't a literal point that he was making, but it was hyperbole. A lot of people are going after Christ, right? He has tons of followers, right? We could say that all of Halifax went downtown to see the Navy ships go out to sea. Well, that's all hyperbole, and it's acceptable, and we have to understand it that way. So that's why the literal sense is also known as the plain sense. We just take it as basic English. Like we use hyperbole, we use metaphors, we use figures. In the book of Hebrews, he speaks of Old Testament passages being full of types and figures and shadows. Well, those are all legitimate usage of both English and of the narrative in the Old Testament, right? But it's not the literal sense if we mean that literal the same way as, I say that end table is made out of wood. Well, that's literal. It really is made out of wood, right? But the literal portion of our hermeneutic is not a wooden literalism, right? There's flexibility according to our language, right? But we take it for what it means. We don't try and change it. Using a 1,000-year example again in the book of Revelation. It says 1,000 years. There's no reason why it shouldn't be 1,000 years. There's no figure attached to it. It's 1,000 years. Why would we think of it to be anything else, right? And that's why I like David Cooper's golden rule of interpretation. And I didn't realize he'd only passed away here a few years ago, but when the plain sense of Scripture makes common sense, seek no other sense. Right? Therefore, take every word in its primary, ordinary, usual, literal meaning, unless the facts of the immediate context studied in light of related passages and axiomatic or self-evident and fundamental truths indicate clearly otherwise. For instance, turn to Genesis chapter 1. And when you come to Genesis chapter 1, it says there in verse 3, and God said, let there be light, and there was light, and God saw the light, and that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness, and God called the light day, and he called the darkness night, and the evening and the morning were the first day. Now, in normal English, basic English, if we say the first day of, let's say the first day of the week, or the first day period of a certain event, we're talking about a specific day, 24 hours, day and night. Together, that's one day, right? And we know that because it's qualified by a number. Okay, so in normal usage, whenever we use a number along with the word day, it's always a literal 24-hour day. Okay? But if I was to say, like if I was to say in speaking to Sean and Shay, who'd be two of the youngest here, you guys have all these video games, you have all these different things to do, but in Ian, in my day, we didn't have all of that stuff, right? We weren't quite running around with sticks and hula hoops out back, but we had